My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And today we are looking at the sorcerous folly of the Sky-Blind Spire.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Okay, so what is the Sky-Blind Spire? It is a one-page adventure location written and illustrated by Michael Prescott. The format of it is a single landscape page, A4 sized for me, but maybe some other size for you if you're in America, with an isometric view map surrounded by its descriptions and various encounters. The location itself within the game is a fortified tower that was built by a wizard as a kind of magical ritual in architectural form. But since that wizard died, it's been used as a fortress, or if you will, keep, in this Borderlands region by different groups, so it's changed hands.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Yeah,
sorry,
pressing
continue.
on. So, like, the key feature or, selling point of this thing is it's got a puzzle in it. Every room in this tower has a number on the floor from 1 to 23. And some of them are really obvious. As soon as you walk in, there it is, engraved on the floor. Some of them are more difficult to find because it's been covered over or deliberately or otherwise. But what happens is, as soon as you walk into room number 1, every character attracts a tiny orbiting spark of magical energy. And when you go to the next room in sequence, each time the spark gets bigger and brighter. And if you step into any room out of order, the spark just disappears and you have to start all over again. And if you can figure out how to get it all the way to number 24, which doesn't actually have a number but is the end, then the big spell that the wizard planned all those years ago is activated. What else do I need to mention?
Well, we should probably mention its very twisty MC Escher-esque layout,
Yeah,
right?
before getting to the other features, because that's actually important to solving that puzzle as well. So the windows and the interior doors, but fortunately not the front door of this tower, are all magical as well. So the doors make the map wrap around like the Pac-Man screen on the arcade game. You go off one side, you just come back on the other. And for the listeners at home, I'm pointing in directions that you can't see. While the windows or many of them, face the wrong way, or they're on a different floor. So there's one room, for example, where you walk in and on what would be the north wall is a window, but if you look out of it, what you actually see is the landscape to the west. So yeah, that navigating all that is the confusing fun. What else is going on? Oh, and the name of the Sky-Blind Spire, right? That's not the wizard's name for it. There's a bunch of goblins who have... there's a lot going on. So there's a bunch of goblins who've come to raid the tower for, silver cutlery and stuff. And they've cast a spell on it that makes anyone that goes inside unable to see things that are blue. And this takes effect gradually after you enter the building. So
that's
their plan
the sky
is
blindness, right? Yeah.
That's the sky blindness, right? So they just cover themselves in a blue cloak or whatever, and they're invisible to anyone that's inside.
And they do, like, one of the things I like is they do little raiding missions into the tower. Like, they put on their little blue cloaks so that no one can see them and go in and out, like stealing silver and stuff. Yeah.
What else is going on? Oh, there's a bunch of giants who came in, got affected by the sky blindness, and are now trapped and confused. There's a magic fountain with some water spirits in it.
Evil ghost idols, dire pelicans,
evil ghost idols,
all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, there's a sort of thing where if you go up the corridor, you get bigger, and if you go the other way, you get smaller. Which doesn't really seem to tie into anything, I have to say. But
I thought that was a little odd too. Yeah. I was like, okay. Yeah. But thematically, it kind of fits because there are also like these giant things in the dungeon, so they're kind of the sort of like size changing thing as a theme, I guess, is there.
Yeah, but I think that's all the main elements of what's in the dungeon, in the Spire. What did you find particularly appealing about it, Jason?
So, just sort of big picture, Michael Prescott, I have been a Patreon backer of Michael's for a long time now, actually. He he puts out dungeons like this on I think on a monthly basis, or maybe not quite monthly, but on a fairly regular basis. These isometric dungeons with the text, and he makes them available for free on his website. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. But he supports the work by running a Patreon, right? And so you give him $1 for every time he releases one. It's like the easiest dollar like you'll spend like ever. The artwork is beautiful. I mean, like he's such a good artist, and the level of detail on this map is like really, really cool. It's actually kind of a shame that it might be against the spirit of the game to show the players the map, right? Because it's actually like it's quite lovely. Maybe we can talk about that later, but
yeah.
So just at the outset, like this series of 1-page dungeons that Michael does is totally worth your support, listeners. I mean, go take a look at that stuff. Speaking about the Sky-Blind Spire specifically, I don't normally love a puzzle dungeon. Okay. I have played plenty of sessions where the dungeon was a puzzle dungeon, and it can be just kind of frustrating, right? Like, especially if the GM is really committed to not having any out of character conversations, or like being willing to reveal details of the puzzle. It can be super frustrating. Having said that, I think, and I know this is one of the things you like about it too, I think that this is a puzzle dungeon that is not going to be super irritating in that way. It's a challenging puzzle, but not so challenging that you can't figure it out, right? Like it's just challenging enough, I guess, is what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, that's right. And I can prove it with anecdotal evidence because I ran it, and that's what happened. Like the players figured out the scheme pretty much immediately, because I think those first few rooms have been quite carefully placed so that you will get a bigger spark a couple of times and then suddenly lose it.
Right. The spark is the key.
Straight away you figure it out.
Yeah. The little spark is the key to making the puzzle work. I haven't run this yet, like you have, but I'm imagining it in play, and it's like, okay, we're in room 1. There's a number 1 on the floor, and there's a little tiny spark. Maybe we notice the spark, maybe we don't, but maybe we notice the spark in room 2 or room 3, whatever. The spark is getting bigger, and then suddenly it goes away, and you make the connection with the numbers. It's a pretty easy, I don't want to say it's an easy puzzle, but it's a fairly straightforward puzzle, right? It's not the kind of thing that's going to slow things down, you know?
Yeah, there's no confusion about what you have to do.
Right,
also,
exactly.
It was great for creating teamwork as well. Like my guys, I think they chose 1 or 2 people to have sparks, and then the others would go scouting out rooms. So like if they stepped through the door, it didn't matter, because if they lost their spark and so on. And that was quite cool.
Yeah. And I think, just to sort of like deepen the puzzle a little bit, I think the thing that makes it really I think ideally what is supposed to make it sing is that, the basic puzzle is pretty straightforward, but there's this sort of added layer of the strange geometry of the dungeon, right? And the twisty corridors and the windows that don't match up and all that stuff, right? Like, or the floors that don't match up and all this like business. I think that's the part that kind of makes it, that takes it to another level, right?
Yeah. Cause you have to, well, this is a spoiler, but we're 100% spoiler.
It's 100% spoilers, yeah.
Basically, at least one point, maybe more, you have to go out of a window, right, to do it. And you have to figure out which way the windows are pointing in order to get between the 2 floors. And there's actually a clue to that, which I only figured out while I was writing up the notes before this recording, which is the wizard is described as falling to his death. And basically, if your characters ask around about the tower and the legends before they go there, they could find that out. They would think, well, why was this guy climbing around somewhere he might fall? And that is in itself haunting.
Yeah. It kind of like, it does beg the question, right? Like, well, why did that happen? The other thing I liked about it is this seems like a pretty easy one-shot to me. The scope of the dungeon and the straightforwardness of the puzzle seems like you could get this done in one shot. Were you able to get it done in one shot?
Yeah, although I think for a more typical kind of fantasy game like Dungeon World or D&D or anything, it might go to 2 sessions, because I think it would be done slower. Mine was much more mission focused because I ran it using Breakers by John Harper. So they had a specific thing they had to do, and they had a time limit because it's got the built-in countdown.
This would be great for Breakers, wouldn't it? Because Breakers has a sort of like meta, like a sort of meta layer, like on top of it a little bit of like, it's like a game show or something, right? Isn't it? Like some kind of, or isn't that the idea? Or am I getting
not
that
quite.
wrong?
It's basically it's Ghostbusters, but you fight orcs.
Oh, okay. I thought it was something different for some reason. Anyway,
I should do it as a game show. That'd be better.
Yeah, well, it has because the dungeon has that kind of vibe, right? Like it's got this sort of like treasure of the crystal castle or whatever the hell that old game show is called.
Crystal Maze.
Okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, I could see it being a pretty easy 2-shot too. I mean, like, I feel like you're going to get a lot of your session might be taken up by the encountering the goblins in the front, and the approach to the actual tower itself. It feels like once you get in the tower, though, I bet I could do that in one session. Like once you actually kind of get in the tower.
I think so. I think so.
Anything you want to add about like things you liked about it?
No, I think that's it for now. Anyway.
Well, so what about questions we have about this dungeon? I have a couple. My main one, I know it's kind of one of yours too, a little bit, or we're gonna address it later in the in a later segment. But I'm thinking the sort of the weirdness, the twistiness, the sky blindness is really fun in theory, but having not played it, I feel like I would have a hard time keeping all of that straight. And importantly, how do I convey all of that to the players without just straight up saying, hey, this window is not looking out in the direction you expect it to, right? Like, how do you sort of convey that? That's my one question. I know we're going to talk about some of that stuff later. I will say that question is coming from the perspective of like, if I were running this in a more traditional manner, as the way I normally run games, I don't mind that out of character conversation personally. Like at my tables, I don't mind having that conversation, because my players are really accustomed to jumping in and out of character pretty seamlessly, right? So, and keeping the two separated. So I wouldn't mind like just straight up saying like, you notice that this window is not looking out in the direction it should be. But, some people, especially if you want it to be more like a puzzle, more like a mystery, not like just lots of out of character conversation, you might want to have to manage that.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's the main thing you have to think about when you're prepping it.
The other question I have is, there's a note in the dungeon about the giants not being able to escape the tower because of a tapestry hanging over a corridor, and the tapestry's blue, and there's something about the sky blindness that makes them not able to see it or something. I couldn't make that out. I couldn't figure out why the giants can't get out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this was on my list as well of things we have questions about. So I think I've seen online someone asked Michael Prescott about this, and he sort of was like, "Oh, I can't remember either." I think it's like who killed the chauffeur in The Big Sleep. But the thing with the tapestry makes sense, right? When you can't see anything blue, like you go to where the wall where the door out has a blue curtain over it, and you can't see a door to get out through. So. But the thing is, there is another exit that they could use. So
yeah, they could just come the other way. Sort of, I don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand why they can't just like bypass that and go the direction that the party came from. Right? Yeah, that part's weird to me.
Yeah, I mean, nobody asked for a start in my game, but my thing I'd come up with was just they'd only recently arrived and got confused, so they hadn't had time to figure out that. Yeah, it's not in there.
Those were my questions, though.
Yeah, no, those were the Giants one was mine. The other one is not a problem if you're running it in breakers because you just tell them to go there, but there is a bit of a what's my motivation problem. Like, why would you go and explore this thing? Like, if you've got to find some reason for them to go in there. But then again, like, I think that puzzle is intriguing enough that people would just do it to do it. Like, you don't actually need to give them a particularly solid,
my players would. I mean,
motivation.
I'm thinking about my experiences at the table, and we're all there to do a thing, right? So, like, they tend to like discard like any sort of like realistic motivations and just do the thing that we're clearly there to do as a group of players, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Having said that, it's a one-page dungeon. I mean, I think the idea is you slot it into your ongoing campaign somehow, right? Like, maybe there's some other little reason why you might be at that tower apart from just, that doesn't seem like too difficult to me. I think that's a question that kind of comes out of the nature of the format that he produces these in, right?
Yeah, and you just slot it in as you go. Yeah, actually, it would be quite interesting to try to not engage with the puzzle. Like if you'd been sent to go and live there as soldiers or something, and you show up and there's all this weird stuff going on in your barracks.
Do you want to kick off the chain lightning round?
Yeah, let's do chain lightning. Number 1 for me is that activating the wizard's big spell actually involves being struck by lightning, and then if you survive it, you get your magic wish or whatever it is that it's supposed to do.
I'm going to say dire pelicans, because that's just funny. Just big, giant fucking pelicans. That's great.
I actually wasn't that keen on the pelicans, but it's different strokes. I like the encounter before. I thought of this possibility and I did it on purpose. I had my guys meet the goblin thief with the blue cloak before they had gone Sky-Blind. So it thought it was invisible and they knew it wasn't, and it was just going, "You can't see me! You can't see me! What's going on?" And so that was good.
Nice. I have one more thing for Chain Lightning. I would say I love that the dungeon itself is a ritual. I just think it's a cool idea. This idea of like an architectural spell. He has a name for it. He has like a made up name for this type of magic. I can't recall it.
I forgot it begins with a K.
Karstomancy
cool, yeah.
I don't have it in front of me, but like super cool idea.
Yeah, and then my last one was actually, architecture related, was just watching my players map this thing on the table. Because like you mentioned, I couldn't show them the map until afterwards. But there's a great bit when Jay was drawing the corridor out of one, and of course it wraps around then. And I described the room they came into, and he just looked up at me and went, "Seriously?"
Awesome. Let's go to the expert delve. Okay, so we have a 2-part expert delve for the Sky-Blind Spire. The first calls back to the last segment, which is managing the weird sort of like physical space of the Sky-Blind Spire. So, Tom, what are your thoughts here?
The thing I was most concerned about with, going through the weird mapping procedure and figuring all this out was the avoidance of uncertainty when it wasn't useful. So, for example, when it came to the windows, the first time they looked out of those windows, instead of saying, this one looks south, but it should be looking north, that kind of thing, I invented a landmark at each compass point. So out of the south was the lake that the tower's next to. East was... Well, actually, east I had to put 2 because I put the goblin camp, which becomes invisible later, so that's a clue, because it's under a blue sheet. And I had like a standing rock, and then to the west was a village. So then when they looked out of different facing windows and saw the wrong big landmark, then they just asked me, what's going on here? And after that, I could just start to refer to them as northeast, south, or west.
That's great.
But, initially,
it's a super good touch. Yeah, that's smart. I like that. So creating these landmarks around the tower itself as a guide. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. And then I also kind of made landmarks myself, which is I color-coded each of the windows based on their actual direction on my map, because it's pretty confusing. The other thing... gradually introducing the Sky-Blind. That's the other thing. I didn't want to suddenly have to say, like, "Oh, you remember that tapestry you saw before? Well, you can't find it now." I didn't want it to be that obvious. So...
Well, it could lead to unhelpful questions too, right? They might immediately start thinking, "Oh, it's a spell that made it invisible," or "Someone stole it," or whatever, right? There's all kinds of reasons.
There's all kinds of things.
They may not like hone in on the precise like nature of why they can't see the tapestry, right?
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this, and I had watched a YouTube playthrough as well before running this, so I deliberately mentioned a bunch of blue things. So there's the tapestries, the goblin camp, I'm not sure what else there is. And I was quite careful to just casually mention that the tapestries are blue, and then once the Sky Blinders kicked in, I stopped describing anything that was blue. And they eventually worked it out, mainly after they captured that goblin thief and then realised they couldn't see his cloak anywhere. But that was something I had to be very aware of the timing on. And then that curse as well, and the rune puzzle can have an unfortunate cross-pollination. There was one bit where I had to just stop and out of character tell a player, "You're right that there's a bit of space missing there," because he was deliberately going to a bit of corridor and looking very hard at the wall, and unfortunately hadn't seen Westworld, so I couldn't just give him a clue with, "That doesn't look like anything to you." And he was kind of trying to find what he could see on his map was missing space.
Right.
So I had to tell him, that's not the space you're looking for. That's not room 24. But that was the only time it sort of backfired, I think, because I'd prepped.
Yeah, I think you would have to do a certain degree. Just a little bit of like out of character knowledge would have to happen in order for some of this to run smoothly, right? I think it's a good excuse to sort of practice that skill as a GM, right? I think like managing like out of character knowledge and in player knowledge or player character knowledge is a really good skill to develop, you know.
And sometimes just a bit of reassurance that you're not kind of doing gotcha GMing or something. Or like the other week, I was running Apocalypse World, and I just said to a player at one point, "Remember, it's in the rules that I am a fan of your character," that kind of thing. So it's just this kind of I am tricking you, but only through fair means.
Right, yeah. I think one thing I would do, as we're sitting here talking about it, it occurs to me, one thing I would do to get them in the habit of looking out the windows, is I would have like some kind of audio cue, some in-fiction audio cue, right? That would like signal them to go look out the window, right? And it might be something connected to one of my landmarks that I had created to indicate northeast, south, and west, right? I think that's something I would do just to get them in the habit of doing it, as I'm sitting here thinking of it. Because it would be kind of like,
what kind of
how do you convince them to go look out the window? Right?
I didn't really have that problem, but yeah, I guess just like some sort of a sound that's coming from one particular direction, I guess.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just another idea, I guess. Yeah, that's great. I would love to hear if other people have run this. I would love to hear like how they kind of handled some of this. But I'm also super interested in the mapping too. Like you said, you had your players just drawing the map as you described it, right? Yeah, that's an unusual thing for me. I always just kind of throw the whole map on the table and just let the players see everything.
I normally do too, but I knew that this time it would ruin the fun.
Yeah, it would ruin the fun of this one, I think. Yeah. Okay, so for the other part of the expert delve, I wanted to talk about. Okay, so one of the things that kind of bugs me in a dungeon crawl is how it feels like the monsters and the encounters are very cabined off from one another, you know? I don't know if you've experienced this or not, but it's like, okay, over in room X, we have these ghosts, or we have these like evil spirits or these monsters, and we're not aware of them until we go to room X, and we're maybe not aware of them after we leave room X, right? It's like they just exist in this little tiny space, and I just find that to be super unrealistic, and it really, really breaks my sort of like immersion, right? Like I just don't like it. And so one of the things that in Dungeon World, the front creation process in Dungeon World, it gives you the tools to basically make sure that the dungeon has a sort of ecology to it, you know, like every little part of what's ever in the dungeon can be felt in different parts of the dungeon, right? And so I think it would be helpful. I think this is good advice for just any kind of dungeon crawl, not even just specifically this one. But I think it would be helpful, like, to create like a set of countdown clocks, which is essentially all that Dungeon World fronts are, right? In order to help manage the players sort of experiencing the wholeness of the dungeon at all times, right? Does that make sense? Am I making sense here?
Yeah, so you're talking about kind of, well, not even really foreshadowing, because these would also be in fiction things that they can
right,
hear
exactly,
or see that give clues, right?
Yeah, so the way it works in Dungeon World is all of the major threats in the dungeon, you break them up into what's called a danger, okay? And the danger has a countdown that's called they're called Grim Portents in Dungeon World. But they're basically just like a set of fictional little things that happen that are kind of counting down to that danger doing its big bad thing, right? And I have created a set of dangers, really a whole adventure front for the Sky-Blind Spire, and I'm going to have the text for that linked in the show notes so people can go check it out. But I want to just share an example one to kind of show what I'm talking about here. So one of the things that happens in the dungeon is you have these wicked idols, okay? I think they're in room 13. You have these wicked idols. There's 4 statue idol things, and they have these ghosts, these evil spirits inside of them that are able to animate corpses and possess the players and all that kind of stuff. If I were running this, I would want to telegraph the presence of these ghosts and these idols like really early, okay? And so I'd begin my countdown. Now in Dungeon World, this might happen as a result of a roll, but even in a more traditional game, like if you were running this in D&D, you could just do this stuff, right? You could just begin slowly unfurling all this stuff for your players. Step 1, a corpse is seen twitching as if animated by some unseen force. Okay, so the players see that. It's something they take note of. Maybe they investigate it, whatever. Step 2, a PC feels the gentle stroke of cold fingertips on the back of their neck, and then nothing. Next step, a PC begins to hear incessant whispering in his ear, like something is trying to get inside his head. And the final move here, a ghost attempts to possess the PC. That is how I would unfurl that, and it's stuff that would happen in lots of different places in the dungeon. And maybe they put 2 and 2 together when they finally get to the idols. Maybe they don't, but they know it's a thing that's happening. It's ever present, and that's how I like to do a dungeon.
Okay, so I have a question about this then. In terms of applying it to the Sky-Blind Spire. Those last two steps, I think, are things that actually happen in Room 13. So if you hadn't used any of the previous Grim Portents, and then the PCs arrive in that room, would you jump ahead, or would you?
If they start fiddling with the idols, if that's the thing that's supposed to happen when you fiddle with the idols, I would just go ahead and jump ahead to do that. Right. I would try to time it out though, right? I find those countdowns helpful because it helps me pace out the story, and pace out the tension of the dungeon. And so I would know, like in the very first room of the dungeon, there are metal cages with bodies in them, right?
Body,
yeah, you can straight away get started on that, right?
Yeah, good stuff.
By having the corpses twitch. So yeah, that's my thought. I've written these things. They're written for Dungeon World, but you could take them and apply them in any fantasy game. Just using them as countdowns. Just little bits of fiction you can drop in here and there to sort of mount the pressure up for the players. And now let's go to companion adventures.
Coming this October 20th, 21st, and 22nd. Brought to you by the generosity of our wonderful patrons and the Gauntlet community is Gauntlet Con. Gauntlet Con is an online gaming convention. Our schedule will have games happening across American, European, and even Asian and Australian time zones. Games run by gaming notables, panels, contests during the convention with fabulous prizes. We're going to have a virtual tavern for hanging out between games. It is going to be amazing. Do you want to help out? We'd love to hear from you. Do you want to make your voice heard and tell us what we should make sure to include at GauntletCon? You can. Check the show notes for this episode. There are links to Google surveys. We would love to hear from you. Thanks, and clear that calendar for October 20th through 22nd, 2017.
Okay, companion adventures. I really struggled with this. I don't know about you. It seems this has a very kind of specific, not exactly comical, but not particularly menacing air to it. So, whatever. Anyway, my first thing is the film Labyrinth, starring David Bowie and a young... who is it? Jennifer
Connelly.
Jennifer Connelly, yes. Yeah. And Muppets, mainly starring the Muppets.
Mostly starring Muppets and David Bowie's crotch. Those are the two main things.
Yeah, well, that's the lesson about David Bowie's.
I love it. That was what I honed in on that immediately. That was mine too. When you put it in the notes, I was like, "Fuck, you already put Labyrinth down." It's Labyrinth, right? I mean, not only because Labyrinth has all kinds of twisty architecture, but also because in the Sky-Blind Spire, the goblins and the giants just read as funny to me. These giants that can't figure their way out of the tower, and they're arguing and stuff, and these goblins that just seem a little comical to me, right? And so the Muppet characters, the goblins and stuff in Labyrinth, I feel like there's the same vibe. I think watching the Labyrinth before running this would be a great inspiration.
Yeah. Because there's some stuff in Labyrinth that's creepy or scary, and there's some stuff in this that is as well. But the general tenor is...
Yeah, I think it's a good tone fit. It's like dark and funny, right?
Yeah. Okay, what you got?
I'm going to say the only other thing I have is kind of king on Labyrinth and this idea of 80s fantasy. I'm going with some synthwave music, which I know is something you're a fan of as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to suggest Midnight Laser Warrior by Night Satan. I think that there are a lot of tracks on that album that have that really, really good sort of 80s fantasy synthy vibe to it. It just seems like a good fit for this. So, should get you in the mood.
Night Satan. Got it. Okay, what else have we got? I've got 4 books as The Tales of the Dying Earth, available in various collections or as single things by Jack Vance, which feature powerful but not very sensible wizards and ancient things that were constructed a long time ago, but nobody really remembers why. So it's kind of an okay fit, I think. Your adventurer is going to be more like the Eyes of the Overworld, sort of scrambling around adventurer types, but the actual guy who built this tower is more like Rialto and those other ridiculous pompous sorcerers. And then my final thing, which I suddenly remembered earlier today, is the 1980s British children's TV show Knightmare, with a K on the front. Knightmare, because it involves swords and stuff. I guess I should briefly explain this for people who haven't seen it. It's all over YouTube, so check it out if you can stand it. The idea was one kid would be going into a dungeon and having adventures, but he had to wear this helmet that prevented him from seeing anything because in the infancy of computer graphics, he was just standing, or she, let's be honest, it was always a he, was standing in a blank room surrounded by just jobbing actors who were playing the NPC parts, and all the special effects were displayed on the screen for the kids' friends who had to say stuff like, take 3 side steps to your left, Gavin, grab the cabbage, that kind of thing, and help him to solve puzzles. And so, but that features a lot of things that are in this. So puzzles involving stuff being written on the floor, slightly weird geographical layouts, NPCs who appear kind of mad when you first meet them, and then turn out to have some reason for behaving weirdly. And just, it's all a little bit of an arch proposition. It's not a parody, but it's not, there's layers of, there's some irony going on here. So yeah, awesome. Knightmare. Check it out. Yeah.
I shall make a note. Awesome. Well, that's our show, listeners. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to get in touch with us, we can be found in a couple different places. The best place to check is our G+ community for the Gauntlet, which is the community that produces this show. That can be found by going to the community section of G+, searching for the Gauntlet. You'll find us there. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you want to tweet at me specifically and to the Gauntlet generally, you would tweet at Gauntlet RPG. I promise it's a thing that I do. And
do you feel like this thing about Twitter's got out of your control?
Like, I don't know what I just, it's a bizarre thing. It's a puzzle, right? It's a puzzle I'm going to solve someday. And finally, if you love this, we would appreciate your support on Patreon, patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.
And listeners, thanks for listening.
Oh yeah, so Jason, just before we go, I was thinking about the name change idea.
Oh, right, yeah. Fear of a Black Dragon is a pretty crap name. What do you have, suggestion-wise?
Okay, let me see. Yeah, okay, all right. Check this. Illicit communication.
No.
No? All right, license to illicit. Time to get illicit. Jason, I don't think you're understanding what I'm doing here.
I feel flayed.